And when you have an awareness of some kind of loss, some kind of cultural loss, it's worth trying to do something about it. And this is where this series comes in. I'm Ross Douthat, your host for the Film and Culture series at the Athenaeum Center for Thought and Culture. I think when you step back as a cultural consumer, as someone interested in stories and aesthetic experiences and all of the things that the movies have traditionally offered, and recognize where we've ended up, recognize that the movies are no longer central in the way that they were, what the movies consist of has changed, and that there's been loss, then you can hope for and look for and work for two things: regeneration and preservation. And I think there's hope for regeneration. There are various forces that could work against the forces that I myself have just been describing to make the movies as a sort of cultural experience in the way that they used to be have a partial comeback. You can imagine a world, for instance, where the current crack-up of globalization, the closing of certain foreign markets, Chinese and Russian, all of the bad signs of conflict in the world actually have a galvanizing effect on movie making in the United States by creating more commercial opportunities for movies that are not just pitched to the broadest possible audience, that can be sort of culturally particularist again and can focus on the American scene, American settings in a particular way that the movies used to be really good at and haven't been quite as good at over the last 20 years. So out of, sort of the dark the dark clouds of geopolitics, you can imagine a revival of American movie making as something like it used to be. And you can also imagine sort of experiments in how movies are delivered and presented and sold, creating new opportunities for movies for adults, for a culture that encourages movie-going. For instance, you can imagine more movie theaters figuring out that they don't just have to sell every movie as a spectacle that you're willing to spend, hundreds of dollars for a large group of people on popcorn and drinks and everything else to go to, where you're sitting through 25 minutes of previews and all the rest. So much of the movie-going experience at the theaters has been organized around the idea that people are only going to come to the movies if they're seeing a $300 million special effects-driven spectacle, and so you have to squeeze every possible dollar out of them while they're there. And it might be that there are other ways to do things, that you can charge different prices for different movies, which is something that some theaters have been experimenting with, that you can get more people in for a 1 p.m. matinee on a weekday if you're cutting the price and cutting the number of previews and making it a more casual and sort of spontaneous experience. It's very hard to do the movies spontaneously anymore because of the cost and the time and everything else involved. And I think there's probably ways for movie theaters to figure out how to make spontaneous moviegoing a little easier, which could have a real effect on the kinds of movies that get made and sold. But neither global trends nor innovations in how movies are sold and pitched are going to completely undo the macro level trends I've just described, or draw people fully back out of the home entertainment worlds that streaming and internet and everything else have created for them. And so with that in mind, people who love the movies have to recognize that they are, in part, lovers of a form that needs to be self-consciously preserved in the way that people understand that other art forms, again, novels, plays, theater, ballet, opera, everything else, have understood that they need to be preserved and transmitted for a long time, right? That it's not just, you're not going to have the movies automatically the way you could sort of assume that you would between the years 1945 and 1995. And so you have to become a little bit more intentional in how you think about supporting the movies, how you think about presenting the movies, how you think about educating young people about the movies, right? When I think about some of my own movie-going experiences, some of them actually happened at college where, I had classes that would assign 2001: A Space Odyssey, or the documentary When We Were Kings, or Blade Runner, as part of a larger humanities course. I had a bunch of movies that were assigned as part of a class called The Concept of the Hero in Greek Civilization, where the professor didn't just assign the Iliad or the Odyssey, he also reached forward to sort of examples of heroic myth-making in 20th century American cinema. And I think there are going to need to be a lot more experiments along those lines, where just as we have arguments, and there's lots of interest and controversy about what novels are kids assigned in high school, thinking about what movies kids are shown in high school and college. What constitutes an education in the American cinematic tradition? Those are going to become more and more important questions in a world where the movies aren't quite as central in sort of everyday commercial pop culture as they have been for generations. You cannot just take for granted that there will always be good movies for grown-ups playing in your multiplex, or good movies for kids, or good movies for teenagers, or date movies, or any other kind of movie. You can't take it for granted in the way that you would have for a long time. And so you need to both think about how you yourself approach the movies. You need to think about trying to sort of fashion that kind of immersion, that kind of separation from other experiences that, again, before the smartphone was just sort of the way things were. It needs to be a chosen thing now. And you need to think about the movies you choose to watch as a form of lifelong education, the same way that you might think about the novels that you read. And the same goes if you're a parent thinking about, or a teacher for that matter, thinking about how to introduce your kids to American movies. There are lots of movie theaters that play classic movies all the time. You can probably find one in your area. And it's worth actually going and seeking out those kind of experiences. Doing it for yourself, doing it for your kids, doing it for your students, because you aren't going to get that kind of experience automatically just as a kind of passive consumer of American culture anymore. So if The Godfather is playing one night a week, in between everything else, you owe it to yourself to go and see that, to go and have that experience in a way that just wouldn't happen automatically, I think, anymore. For filmmakers, I think it's important not to be disheartened at the shrunken audiences for the kind of movies that used to find much larger audiences than they do now. Again, serious movies for grown-up viewers. Because there are many ways in which it's easier to make those kind of movies. The cost of technology, what you need in order to set up a movie, what you need in order to learn the craft of movie making. In certain ways, technology has made the craft of movie making more accessible than it ever was before. The reality is that your movie for grown-ups may not make $100 million the way it would have in a different dispensation, but as a work of art, it's still worth making. The audience might be there for it enough to make it at least somewhat commercially viable, and you want to pursue that goal and not just find yourself absorbed into the blockbuster machine, as so many talented people tend to be. And so I think what we're trying to do with this series is make a small contribution to that effort, to think about what about the movies, the great 20th century American art form, younger Americans need to know about and need to experience firsthand. And we're trying to offer that kind of experience in a way that also, at least for, people who don't just watch videos of me talking, but actually come to the Athenaeum Center to hang out and watch the movies that we try and curate. The idea is that you can have an experience that is social, is civic, is convivial, that recreates the best of what the movies as a social institution, not just a cultural institution, offered to American life for decades and decades. It's obviously, any film series is going to be a small contribution to that effort, but hopefully it's a model for other similar experiments, and hopefully it sets people thinking about how, in their own lives, because we're all of us cultural stewards in one way or another, we should think about preserving and transmitting the glory of American movie making to generations yet unborn. There are also ways in which you might hope that different forms of social and civic renewal can actually happen together, and that America might reach a point where isolation, the individual alone with their device or laptop screen, the sense of loneliness that pervades so much of American society reaches a point where there's just a strong swing back to going out and doing things communally along multiple dimensions. And so you can imagine a world where more people are in church on Sunday for the same reason that more people are in the multiplex on Saturday night.